closed his eyes and was silent. A minute. And then he said, "That concludes the formal part of my presentation."
Right, folks, we're all set.
Okay. So welcome. Welcome to those of us who are here in the room, and welcome to those of you who are able to join online. Thank you so much for being here. Today is July 28th, Monday, and we're in the first session of our lecture program. Our theme this morning for the week is God's promises, their significance in the biblical narrative and their significance for the spiritual journey. Now that is also the title of my talk, because this talk is an introduction to the week's theme. And I'm Gard Perry. So this is how our theme is written in the website. In advance, God made 7 important promises in the biblical narrative called covenants. The first is made to Abram and Sarai. The 7th is found in the book of Revelation. Those promises provide a structure for the whole biblical narrative, suggesting what can be in store for us within our own spiritual journeys. This week, presenters will note where each promise occurs in the biblical narrative, observe its received literal meaning, and will note its internal sense. Please join us for a Swedenborgian telling of the greatest story ever told. So this morning, it's my privilege to bring attention to George Dole's unpublished manuscript, The Promised Kingdom, a biblical image of personal growth, in which he offers a summary of the whole book in the way only George can do. I will read that summary to you in my talk this morning. But first, let's say a few words about George and how this book came to be. The year is 1985. There is a small group of students in the Swedenborg School of Religion, as it was then known, in the sunroom. And yes, there was a sunroom. There were 2 sunrooms in this mansion, a large brick edifice, sort of in the early 20th century brick mode, on an estate of a former industrialist in Newton, Massachusetts. There were servants' quarters in this building, which housed the faculty offices and student housing. There was a parlor and a large dining room with a huge oval oak table with a chandelier. That was a classroom. And yes, there were 2 sunrooms facing to the south, one for the chapel and one for a small class. Sun streaming in. And there in the classroom is Robert McCluskey. There is Sue Turley. There is Paul Martin. And I am there. George Dole walks in. He's our professor, teaching biblical studies, the biblical narrative, and theology. And he's got a notebook with him, and he says to us, he looks a bit excited, "I've got a new idea. I'd like to start working on it with my students. It is to correlate what I understand to be major stepping stones, or what he calls stages in the biblical narrative, their covenants. I'd like to correlate that with some knowledge that's new to me," said George, "and that would be James Fowler's Stages of Faith." He seemed to see a correlation, and he would name the chronological stages with which we're all familiar, and with which of course I'll say. And I'd like to work on that with you, and here's the prologue and first chapter. 1985, and that's how the story began, and it took 2 years. This book remained unpublished, though there are those who claim with some validity that it did become the book about us. And certainly there are definite similarities and developments. So, with that, I will. I'm going to name the 7 covenants first. These will be embedded in the narrative story that George tells. I'll say them again at the end and then correlate with those with the literal stages of childhood, youth, adolescence, adulthood, midlife crisis, spiritual rebirth, and life in accord with heaven. So as the biblical narrative unfolds at the beginning, middle, and end, many of us will recognize the major stepping stones. There's the first 11 books of Genesis, which are mythological. They tell a truth about psychological and spiritual development in human beings, we think. And then history begins with the call of Abram, which we heard this morning in chapel. Genesis chapter 12, and what unfolds after that, followed by Moses the lawgiver. That's the 10 Commandments. That's the second stage. There are 7 of these. Joshua in Judges, which is all about occupying the Holy Land, from the Canaanites, after which David becomes king. That's 1, 2, 3, 4. 5 is when it all falls apart. We may remember the exile and Jeremiah the prophet and how things aren't going so well, but there's still a promise of restoration. Jesus comes with a message, the kingdom of God, restoration at last. Descent of the holy city is stage 7. So there you have it. That's our kind of intro to the whole story. But
What about Noah?
we skipped Noah. And there was a reason for that.
All right.
I'll get to that. Good question, though. If the rest of you would be willing to hold your questions to the end, I'd be very grateful for that. So, I think I just covered the intro. George begins with his introduction. So everything I'm going to read right now is George's, penned from George Dole. The Bible, George writes, tells a story no less interesting, the story of your life or of mine. To see the one mirrored in the other has involved for me, says George, a fresh sense of how to be human, profoundly akin to all persons and very much in process. The primary value I see in this story is its typicalness, its realism, composite authorship, its involvement with both events and values, all combined to give it wide applicability that has admitted of so many different approaches and interpretations. I see it as embodying fundamental principles of growth, as being broadly characteristic of the way life still unfolds. We begin as small creatures facing an unknown future. We live, we learn, and with the most profound learning coming through adversity. That's the end of his introduction. And then George would have us believe there is value in hearing the whole story as one continuous narrative, which he does in his own way, which I can only tell you is just beautiful. It is elegant, it is compact, it is precise, and those of us who remember listening to George, this is quintessential George. He begins. This is the first 11 chapters, the mythological part, the Garden of Eden, etc. I see the first 11 chapters of Genesis as prologue to the whole story, setting the stage for the drama that is about to unfold. The Bible portrays the beginnings of our world as virtually ideal. God reviews creation and everything is very good. The first obvious problems occur when the primal couple heeds the serpent's promise that they become like gods, knowing good and truth and knowing good and evil. This leads to a loss of paradise and ultimately a state of near total depravity. There is a purifying flood with Noah and his family, the only people saved. And there is a new beginning, not as auspicious as the first. Finally, the story is told of human efforts to build a tower to reach to heaven and God scattering the builders, confounding their languages in order to prevent hubris. The result is that we have moved from an ideal beginning to a very recognizable human condition. People of different languages living in various parts of a relatively difficult world. Stage 1. At the close of the 11th chapter in Genesis, the focus zooms in on one individual, Abram. And the 12th chapter begins with a communication he receives from God, which, since I take it as the mainspring of the plot from this point on, it may be quoted in full. First 3 verses of which I'm so happy to say we're reading after chapel. Here it is again, just the first 3 verses. This is the mainspring of the plot. Leave your country, God commands Abram, your relatives and your father's house, for a land I will show you. I will make you a great nation. Be a blessing. I will bless whoever blesses you and curse whoever curses you, and all the families of the earth will be blessed through you. Genesis chapter 12, 1-3. Abram does indeed travel to the land of Canaan, at which point he receives a message that this is the land he has been promised. The story then focuses on the provision of descendants. The immediate issue is Abram's and Sarai's childlessness. He and his wife are elderly, and the prospects for their becoming a great nation are remote. First, Ishmael is born to Abram by a surrogate wife, Hagar, and then miraculously, Sarai gives birth to Isaac. The 2 boys are rival claimants to the promise. The conflict is carried on by their mothers. It is resolved when God makes it clear that while Ishmael will be looked after, Isaac is the true heir to the promise of a holy land. After some uncertainty about finding a wife for Isaac, the next generation consists of twin sons, Esau and Jacob. Jacob is a wheeler-dealer and manipulates his elder brother into ceding his birthright. This leads to Jacob's, temporary exile, during which he prospers significantly. And eventually there is a reconciliation. Jacob ultimately has 12 sons, of whom the 11th, Joseph, is the one obviously enjoying divine favor. His elder brothers resent this and plot to kill him, but wind up selling him as a slave to a caravan headed to Egypt. In Egypt, Joseph rises through considerable difficulty to a position of national power. And when his brothers come to Egypt to buy grain because of a famine in Canaan, he sets in motion a plan to reunite his family in Egypt. Stage 2. The book of Genesis ends with Abram's descendants numerous and prosperous, but in Egypt. That is, they have made numerical progress toward becoming a promised nation, but they have lost ground geographically. The next book, Exodus, immediately notes a radical change of fortunes. Joseph is dead. A hostile ruler on the throne is in Egypt, and the chosen people are in slavery. The story then moves to the figure of Moses, who engages the hostile ruler, wins his people's release, and leads a miraculous escape into the wilderness between Egypt and Canaan, where at Mount Sinai the overwhelming voice of God presents the laws which must be obeyed if the promise is to be fulfilled. There is a march from Sinai to the border of the Promised Land, at which point the people decide not to undertake a conquest for fear of the military strength of the inhabitants. For this lack of faith in the promise, they are sentenced to wander in the wilderness for 40 years until the reluctant generation has died. In general, the people are portrayed as discontented and chafing under the restrictions of the law. Moses dies. Under the leadership of Joshua, the people do enter the land, crushing organized resistance in 2 major battles. But this was far from total occupation. They took control of various towns and cities, while others, often neighboring ones, remained in Canaanite hands. Phase 3. The book of Judges tells of a people without central leadership living from crisis to crisis. As we move into the books of Samuel, however, two things change. First, Samuel quickly emerges as a figure of national importance. And second, the Philistines come onto the scene as a threat to national significance. This means there is, despite the need for this means there is a desperate need for national unity at precisely a time when there is an individual who can make it happen. The result is that Samuel, who is not a military man, anoints the first king, Saul. Saul is initially successful but unstable, and young David comes to the fore as king, moves his capital to the border city of Jerusalem, unites the people, manages to subdue all the surrounding nations, and with the nation secure, the Ark of the Covenant in Jerusalem, the promise to Abram has been fulfilled. His descendants are an independent, secure nation in the promised land with a righteous king on the throne. The success of David, however, does not last long. His successor, Solomon, starts out well, but is seduced by success, lapses into idolatry, burdening the people with the costs of a lavish court. The northern territory rejects him as king, appoints their own king, so that the south remains under the dynasty of David, while the north, the throne, changes often, lasting only a generation or two. This is a problem. Two separate kingdoms are not able to maintain the empire. In the course of the time, Israel is conquered by Assyria and Judah falls to Babylon. Its people are in exile. Stage 5. The next body of biblical text is the prophets. They have no sequence in the narrative that can really be followed chronologically. They are a thread that comprise hundreds of pronouncements about the state and the nation of people, about the state of the nation and its people. For the most part, it is very harsh. Condemnations for their failure to live up to the demands of the law, and of course they're now in exile. Punishment is foretold, and yet throughout there are notes of hope. Punishment will serve to purge the nation. There will be restoration. A new Israel, a faithful Israel, will be established. Stage 6. The Gospel of Matthew sets Jesus in the context of the story we have been following. Though Jesus' work and words are focused on the establishment of a kingdom of God or of heaven rather than a political entity, there is tension throughout the Gospels between the expectation of Jesus' followers and the direction of his own efforts. The Jews in the Holy Land are at the point under control of the Roman Empire. And there are some who trust in the ancient promise and believe that deliverance, independence will somehow come, and Jesus is going to do that. Jesus' charisma awakens hope at the same time that his avoidance of political moves brings doubt. He insists on focusing attention on personal relationships, on the problems of everyday life, rather than working out ways to defeat the system. He advocates loving your enemies. Be merciful. Kindness. He's more interested in overcoming fear than overcoming Rome. Everything comes to a head on Palm Sunday. He does make an apparently political move of coming publicly into Jerusalem, followed by cheering crowds, and confronts people who are commercializing the temple. All enthusiasm and hope that are raised by these events are crushed by his capture and execution later in the same week. Finally, the resurrection transforms the disheartened disciples into apostles who go out to convert the world. stage 7. The book of Revelation follows directly on the Gospels. Luke, who leaves us wondering at the ascension, Revelation begins with a vision of the ascended Christ as seen by John in exile on the Isle of Patmos. This vision continues with John's letters to the 7 churches in Asia Minor, and that is the last we hear of the earthly landscape. From there on, beginning with a vision of the throne of judgment, we move into a realm of cosmic battle, forces of light against forces of darkness. These forces of darkness are finally defeated, and the holy city is seen descending from God out of heaven. In this city, there is a tree of life from the Garden of Eden. There is a river from Ezekiel's vision of a restored temple. There are the names of the 12 tribes of Israel, the names of the 12 apostles. There is the assurance that nothing that violates the commandments will enter, and yet there is also the assurance that the gates of the city are never closed. It is a summary symbol, a place of purity, great, secure, wholly blessed. It is the fulfillment of the promise to Abram, with the focus now for the first time on the theme of being blessed and of blessedness. Okay. So that's a wow. I'm going to pause here and I'm going to go back to the sunroom for a moment while we just let that sink in. I tell you, I was so moved first time I heard it. Moved now. So we'll go back to the sunroom for a moment, and there's George. He's reading. I don't know a darn thing, by the way. I'm a first-year theologue. I guess you call us a first-year student. We were asked to draw a map of the Holy Land. I knew there was something called the Sea of Galilee, and there was a Jordan River, but they actually run north and west, north and south. I put them east and west. I had no idea what the Holy Land looked like, and I was, So I said, I better learn something from this guy, George Dole. And as you're pausing here, and I've got plenty of time, I'm just going to get to the covenants and those stages. I remember feeling and thinking how it was to hear how he could put such a big story into such a knowable pattern, a discourse that was manageable. Oh, I get that. Confidence comes from that. So that was one of George's great contributions, blessing, assets, if you want to call it, was his mind was able to see patterns. And we're going to get to those patterns in just a moment. And he could then, his writing was really literature, and he could then write it so it was easy to read. Some of it. Not all George's writing was easy to read. Paul Zacharias once said, after reading an article that was published in The Messenger by George Dole, he said, you know what it's like reading George Dole sometime? It's like waking up from a dream. And you wake up and you say, wow, I know that dream. It's so vivid. I get it. And then 5 minutes later, you can't remember the dream. You have no idea what it was about. And he said, George's Dole was like a dream. So beautiful, but so elusive in the end. Not this. Not this. This is right there. So embedded in that, I'm now going to read the 7 covenants with just a phrase going with each one. And you'll remember maybe as a little task, if you can, you'll be able to place these in the story that we've just heard after the prologue of the 11 chapters of myth, beautiful myth. There's so-called true history, which is not history that we would call history because they were not scientific in their analysis of events, and this was not how that story was told, and it was not for that purpose. This story was told decades, generations later in order to help the current generation, which was either in exile or very close to it, to find out, how do we get here? How do we get ourselves in this mess? So they looked back and they said, well, it started with the Garden of Eden. Everything was perfect at the beginning, and somehow everything changed. And this was their best account of their own history to see how it changed to bring themselves to the point at which this was actually composed, which was several centuries before Jesus in the first century Palestine. And so they remembered, there was a call, our patriarchs, our matriarchs, there was Abram, remember Abram, let's write that down. Genesis chapter 12, 1 through 3, which we've heard this morning. I will make you a great nation. They're a chosen people. That is history. Israel became a chosen people by God, under one God, and that distinguished them from other nations in the ancient world. They're unique in their monotheism, theism, but by the time this was composed. Moses then came as the lawgiver, the Ten Commandments. I have come down to deliver you from the Egyptians first, and here are the conditions which will allow you to maintain your freedom, the Ten Commandments. Joshua as a judge, able to unite the nation. The Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. It is a violent conquest. They do occupy the Holy Land. David becomes king. It is the Davidic dynasty that Jesus claimed, that claims were made for Jesus. We're not sure he made them, but people did, because David was the archetypal righteous king. Needed some forgiveness, by the way. Was not perfect, but that's not right, not at all. That's not the point. He's an archetype. He's a type of, not just a historical type to tell a later story, he's a type of human being, a developed type. As George will point out, this was his brilliance. As a level of stage of adulthood. That's the adult stage of life when you're sovereign within your own kingdom. Have you ever really needed something really bad and walked up to a friend and said, half my kingdom for, see, you got a kingdom now. That's David. 2 Samuel, I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Jeremiah the prophet, all of a sudden things are not going so well. They themselves were crushed, defeated, killed, taken hostage, deported, living in a foreign land, Babylon. Not so good. But that same prophet, Jeremiah 31, I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel. A new, more internal covenant. I will write my law on your hearts. Things are changing, and this is very much like human life, says George. Jesus is the new covenant. Matthew 26, I will give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Descent of the Holy City, Revelation 12:21, chapter 21, I saw a new heaven and a new earth coming down from God out of heaven. Okay, so those are the covenants. So now we've heard the story told in narrative form. We've seen the 7 covenants, which are embedded, covenants being an ancient way as well as a current way. We don't call them covenants now, we call them agreements, legal, in which you are promised some benefit on a condition that you live within certain conditions. That's what contracts do. Covenant is an ancient form of a contract, and the people of Israel in their history were, and I'll repeat this, were unique to my knowledge, I'd love to be contradicted, as in that ancient world of having established a covenant with their God. received laws to which they were commanded to live, and formed their history. This is actual truth. That did happen. Now, the events that are described and how it's described, the sequence, the people, they weren't real historians as we think of it again. So what do those 7 covenants correlate with? Well, it's pretty obvious in a way. George calls the prologue, which would be the Garden of Eden in particular, as childhood. He actually calls it really infancy. And with Swedenborgian ideas of remains, there's some way to argue that. Remains are God's gift of pure, unconditional, unqualified, unlimited, boundless love, period. Full stop. That's what infants get. Lucky. Now, realistically, some don't, by virtue of very sad circumstances. Well, guess what? God gives a provision for that too. I met a person I know quite well who said, and he's a theologian in our group, he said this in public, but I'm not going to reveal that here, but he's a really good guy. He said, I didn't get those remains. My parents were not that way. I was brought up by my grandmother, and that didn't go so well. I said, well, how do you live with that knowledge that we have? He said, I got that through nature. I was a child. I went out to the nature. Trees, the river, the mountains. That's where I got it. He did. And now, by the way, it's also true that God provides that in heaven for babies. If a baby dies, they're brought up in heaven. Well, that's childhood, and that's infancy. The childhood begins, as we think of it, with some level of autonomy. Here's a command, now go do it. I love speaking to people where there are parents in the audience, because they can go, oh, yeah, I know that. So you can tell a child, they're old enough to know they can understand what you're saying. You tell them to do something. They might or might not do it. They might not quite know how. But they're given a promise, well, you're going to grow up, and you'll eventually figure this out, and it's very good. It's all promise so far. So Abram didn't really receive any conditions. It was just promised. The problem develops when they get old enough to really mess up, and that's where Moses comes in, and you got to lay down the law. These are the 10 Commandments, and for the people of Israel, they needed it to survive. They were in a hostile land with real enemies. And listen, if you're going to survive, you got to do this way. 10 Commandments. First 5 are about God, second 5 are about human relations. And it worked. It worked real well. Joshua comes along, and actually they're successful now, and they do conquer this land. And now David becomes king, so we've moved from infancy to call of Abram as childhood, Moses' youth, Joshua's adolescence. King is sovereign in your own land. You're an adult now. You did a good job. You got a kingdom. You got rules. People are following your rules. Life is good. But then David has Solomon, and Solomon doesn't do so well, and people get self-confident, overly so, and things do not go well. They're conquered, by the way. So this is midlife crisis. I've heard about it. Midlife crisis. I'm not sure when midlife crisis happens. I don't take my own life as any kind of a standard, because I'm a little off the chart, but normally, probably 40s maybe. You got everything. You did some stuff. You followed the rules, and this is all there is. This is it. Yeah, this is it. No, it's not, because things really do and can fall apart, and you have to be ready for that. And the prophets are a great way to remind us that everything that's happening is now two sides. There's two sides. One is there is a bit of destruction going on. The other side is that it is for a restoration. There's something new happening underneath what's falling apart. That's a beautiful promise. That's a keeper. Jesus is born. Midlife crisis is past. The sun is rising. The dawn is dawning. The river is flowing. The air is moving. You open your eyes. You go, oh, what? Oh my goodness. Now see what's going on. Something new. It's in your heart. Everything is starting to make sense. The life of Jesus at first isn't what we thought it would be, or it wasn't what they thought it would be. He's going to make us like David again. He's our King David. He's come back. He's going to restore us, and he's going to defeat Rome. Nope, didn't work that way. It was better than that. The kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven is within you. Now begins the spiritual journey. Mm-hmm. You know, this is where I think Swedenborgians really shine. We really have, as well as others, a beautiful idea of a spiritual journey that really begins in adulthood. It's an interior journey that requires the experiences of an adult. It can certainly happen, and there are versions of it that happen on the way, chronologically, which is what George accomplished in his book. His stages are chronological. Spiritual birth would happen in real adulthood. Maybe now you've got some time and things aren't so hectic. Certain things don't require as much attention to keep our life in the world going. And there's time for meditation, reflection, prayer, maybe joining a spiritual community. Come into Freiburg. And we experience a level of rebirth. Born again. And then Revelation, descent of the holy city, he really calls that a transitional stage, generally chronologically with older adults. Of course, it can happen much earlier. And this would be a transition into the next world. This is life in the next world. Where by the way, where paradise comes back. The tree of life is there. The river in Ezekiel's vision is there from the temple. 12 gates. Hey, guess what? The 12 gates are shut to allow nothing impure, is the word that was used. Impure means nothing that defiles one's life and of others and commandments. That's purged before you get to the 12 gates. And then there's 12 of them, 3 on 4 sides. So you get to pick which gate you want. And they're all different. And I'm going to conclude this. So we do have 20 minutes, so I think I'm good on that. I believe Emanuel Swedenborg may have been the first Western philosopher, theologian, who claimed explicitly that all the major religions of the world are salvation, are stories of salvation. And heaven has... There's a Buddhist heaven, there's an Islam heaven, there's a Judaism heaven. He was tough on Christians. Emanuel Swedenborg said the Christians were the hardest. They were the most difficult. And, of course, Emanuel Swedenborg came in a way to reform, to offer a reformation, which was really Jesus' message brought fresh into the Western world of what we think of now as modernity. The essential message of the church was to return, to restore its initial teaching of love your enemies, love your neighbor, and all will be well because God is in his heaven. Okay. With that, I'm going to end. It's your turn with questions and answers. If you have a question, keep it for just a moment. I'm going to ask one question myself, which is, what's it like for you to hear the summary? that George Dole wrote? That's one question. If you have an answer for that, if you let that percolate, please do. It's a complicated story made simple. What's it like for you to listen to that? Because that was important for George. He wanted to know that. And the second question I have for you, if you don't mind, I'd like to kind of focus on those first, and if you have another one, that's fine, just go for it. The first one was, what was it like to hear that story? The second one is, since George says the story is no less interesting than your life and mine, one mirrors the other. At what point of the story do you see your life being mirrored? So I'll take hands. And Dave Keating has the mic, and if you raise your hand, we'll see it. You could say it. I'll actually write it down so you don't have to jump in right after somebody else. You know what I'm saying? And I have Julie.
Well, I am blown away. I was lucky enough to have George with my training, and as someone who preaches to people explicitly from the Bible, nothing else. And it just feels like all the pieces have fallen together now. Because we love the stories, and I use a lot of the Old Testament.
Yeah, good.
Little bit. So
Very
it's amazing. Thank you.
That's lovely. Actually, that's really good. Julie just pointed out something that, and we're going to be looking for hands. I won't call on people that really don't want to be called on, but I am known to call on people. So many fabulous stories. David and Goliath, the flight out of Egypt. Oh my goodness. The parables. And Jesus told a parable. Katie.
You know something that can take the wind out of a Swedenborgian's sails? When
you really want to do that?
Oh,
Why?
no, I mean, I want you to answer it. Here was the question, and I guess I have my own. I've been percolating in my own thoughts about what my answer would be. But when my, let's just say, when a friend who we would say practices fundamentalism and biblical literalism, and
Go ahead.
biblical living, says, "Oh, I wish that her sister, who was disabled, passed away, and said, oh, I wish it were true. It's a nice thought that we would see each other again in heaven. It's a nice thought." And my mom and I were there, so it was like, well, of course, there's this and there's this. But realizing what we take for granted from the gift that Swedenborg gave us, she says, well, I just can't find anything biblical to support it.
All right. Well, let's hold that thought. I'll respond to that. I want to keep with the topic here. We're talking about, and that's a very real problem and issue. I want to address it. I also want to be somewhat intentional. The week's theme is spiritual growth from a Swedenborgian perspective in the here and now, and this is the basis of the story. I'm asking you, please, reflect on what you've heard that's in this story. What comes up? That's my invitation. And we'll get to Katie's question in a minute. Roz, Martha, I almost want to say Ted's raising his hand. Are you?
I don't think so.
Will you?
I can say something if you want me to.
So if you're willing, we'll just keep these, because we have only 10 minutes, I think, I hope. So Roz, Martha, and Ted, thank you.
Like Julie, I enjoyed hearing the narrative sort of condensed as a continuous story.
There.
Rather than hearing it in isolation, little bits and pieces. But it did open up a gap in my knowledge, which was how you went from the exile back to Israel and Roman occupation. Like I can't recall how that happened.
Could you say that slower and a little bit louder? Just put it in the form of a question, and then
what happened? This is the part of the story that I don't remember. How the northern kingdom being in captivity, how it ended up that they were back in Jerusalem, in
Yes.
Israel, and Jesus
Yes,
was born.
that's a real simple answer, real quick. I can do that one.
And to answer your second question, where am I in my life? Do you want to hear that?
Yeah, I sure do.
Yeah, the midlife crisis is an interesting question, but I feel like now as a senior type of person that the more internalizing of all the teachings and stuff, the way Jesus did, correlates with where I am in my life.
Very nice. Thank you. So while you're passing the mic to Martha, the answer to her question is the Israelites were captured in 2 phases. This will take less than a minute. Assyria captured the northern kingdom 150 years before Babylon captured the southern kingdom. And the southern kingdom was captured 500 years before the birth of Christ. What happened, quite happily, King Nebuchadnezzar was defeated by Alexander the Great. Cyrus was a subsequent king who came to the throne and said, I don't want to keep the Israelites in Avalon. Avalon. King Arthur. We're talking about King Arthur's court in Babylon. He let them go back. They were only in captivity for less than 100 years. And they built the temple, rebuilt the temple. And so 400 years to rebuild a temple, and then Jesus came along, and I got a lot to say about that in my second lecture. So I've got Martha, then Ted, and we're sticking, and I'm going to answer, I will answer your question real quick at the end, but this is an advertisement for the 11 o'clock hour. We're going to have a time to answer those questions, particularly that one, because I don't have time now. I've only got a couple minutes. So, Martha, say your question, and then we'll get to Ted.
This is Martha. I don't have a question. I was answering your question.
Please.
Which I think you said was how did you see this affecting your life?
Yes.
It's very simple to me. I see the whole journey as how my life has gone. You know, from infancy to now. I mean, it's so simple.
Very good. Very good. Let's get a question from Ted. We may not get a complete answer because we do respect the teachers who have to leave. Or maybe he has a comment. Thanks, Ted.
It's more a comment than a question. Thank you, Gard. And I know George through you all and have learned and accepted the reverence that y'all have for him. But I might offer a correction if I were in George's presence, which I think is important because it's how the whole story plays out. The turn from being with Joshua and the judges to the king is not without controversy in the Bible story itself.
Oh, thank
and that,
you.
I think, needs some deep reflection, right? The people call for a king, and Samuel says, you don't want a king. God is your king. And God says to Samuel, no, do it. Do it. They're not rejecting you, Samuel. They're rejecting me.
Right.
And they're going to be oppressed by their king, and I'm not going to deliver them. When you weave that into the story as a whole, I think it actually goes deeper. And that call that at the Jesus stage of living in community, serving one another, not ruling over one another, just becomes so much more powerful and potent.
What a wonderful observation.
So I offer that.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for that. Not without controversy. Why don't we end on that note that Swedenborgians and scholars as well are mindful that the biblical record as we have it is not without controversy. Thank you very much.